The legal framework of this research is supported by the Law 1257 of 2008 of the Congress of Colombia, where the different articles that dictate rights, norms, or awareness, prevention, and punishment of forms of violence and discrimination are exposed.
On the other hand, it is important really on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, proclaiming by the General Assembly to Hitlerhood human rights.
Psychological framework. Gender discrimination against men is little known in the Colombian context. However, it is a latent problem within the communities, thus generating inequality in the judicial processes on domestic violence against men. Taking into account the above, different sociocultural perspectives are observed where social pressure is established as a factor that establishes roles. Being the determining male role, the one that exerts violence relates to the male role, since one is not a victim but an aggressor within the problems of intrafamily violence, the belief and social pressure that men have regarding the very concept of masculinity means that they do not report any type of violence by a woman, thus generating shame, guilt, and fear of one society may determine regarding their social role. As in a cases of violence against women, men also feel they are in abusive relationship in which they cannot report because of some kind.
Historically, there has been inequality and discrimination towards men in judicial process in Colombia. The ideal behavior of men in different situations has always been expected in society. Men should be seen as masculine, strong, and as the provider of their home. On the other hand, men cannot express their feelings because they are seen as fragile and inferior. According to Casanova, since the beginning of the 20th century, men should even be violent, and however did not comply with that, was considered a traitorous faggot, and the term homosexual began to be used. The same author mentions that during the First and Second World War, it was possible to demonstrate the differentiation between gender roles. On the one hand, women had to worry about domestic activities, and on the other hand, men were characterized by their physical strength, virility, and courage. At this time, the risks that supported men were only in the economic and labor fields.
Historically, it's inevitable to talk about the ideologies and gender role without naming the feminist movement and its beginnings in Latin America, especially in Colombia, which is why in the 1970s studies began to appear on the situation of Latin America women in the context of research on development, underdevelopment, and dependency. Within the history of the country, there is a period from 1930 to 1957, in which women had a great role, since Colombian women had the attention of the press, occupying long hours of discussion in the legislative chamber. Their role in society was questioned and produced a great controversy in which not only the liberal and conservative parties participated, but also, and for the first time, the woman itself. Although the main objective of feminism is equal conditions and opportunities from both sexes, it can be seen that this political, social, and philosophical movement has become quite radical, where the main they mention that all oppressive behaviors by men towards women must be reviewed and judged, without taking into account that men also present vulnerabilities and the same situations of sexist oppression, only that the fight of the part of men is difficult due to the naturalization of the strong behavior of the werewolf. This is in 2018. Right now, at present time, there are not a large number of laws that can support men regarding physical, psychological, and economic violence in Colombia. And these laws are directed specifically towards women. There are very laws that protect them simply by the fact of being a woman, although there are very few cases that are persecuted for violence against men. A high number of violence against men by the opposite sex can be evidenced. However, men mention feeling ashamed for when expressing that happens before public entities, since they can have the conception of a strong and superior man. Regarding the risk factors as a consequence of gender violence, there are social, cultural, and relationship risk factors also, such as alcohol consumption, hallucinogenic substances, unemployment, labor difficulties, jealousy, couple conflicts, naturalization of violence, and influence of social constructions based on gender, among others. The most common consequences are physical injury, shame, guilt, post-traumatic stress disorder, miscarriage, a repetition of the cycle of violence, and death. At this time, it can be seen that it has not been possible to reach the term of equality of sex or equitable justice for committing crimes before another subject. And all of this was said by Giraldo in 2016. For this project, we have a series of objectives. As our general objective, we have to identify different social factors that lead to inequality and absence of judicialization of violence against men in Colombia, and how this affects perception of justice and their own mental health. As for specific objectives, we have first to investigate the theoretical basis from a historical perspective on gender violence and the disciplinary support of psychology in relation to research topic. Our second objective is to describe the existing laws in the context of gender violence in relation to the competence of legal field. And third one, we have to apply as a research instrument a structured questionnaire to men residing in Colombia on inequality in the judicialization of violence against men.
The methodology used in the research, taking into account the problem question of the research, a structured questionnaire will be conducted for men residing in Bogota, Colombia, which will address the reason for inequality in the judicialization of violence against men and how this influences the perception of justice and mental health in men who are victims. The questionnaire was applied from the Google Forms tool. However, an accompaniment to the participants was carried out in order to know a little more about the type of abuse and violence, as well as their reaction to be able to express being victims. Therefore, this structured questionnaire will have the following format, where first question will be asked a general level of what is known about the subject, and the second part are at an individual level.
Our third is of a descriptive quality type, where we see of a relevant information of the underlying and analysis of the subjective relatives of which different articles that the sensitive norms prevent and punish for on violence and discrimination are exposed. This day allowed of calling a declared search question on discovering new questioning interpret. Our races will be carried up the best on the Pan-American approach since we want to explore and understand the individual experience of men in relation to different social factors that led inequality and advance judicialization of violence and men in Colombia, and what is affects the perception of Jews and their own mental team, their experience, reading the process, and discover the elements that are present in the experience. The population that will address will be men raised in Bogota, Colombia, which will address the reason for inequality in the application of violence against men and the those influences perception, use, and mental health. The song will man question where the questionnaire is structured so that first question will ask individual level to express and the second part and the general level on the problem.
Procedure. First, the group defines the problem in order to define the legal, psychological, and historical framework and set out the objectives of the research. Then, describes the methodology and the construction of the collection instrument to be able to apply in it, and finally analyze the results through interpretation and concluded the research from the discussion.
Interpretation to the result. In the relation to picture 1, it is evident that of the 21 participants, 16 have been victims of domestic violence. On the other hand, at the time of the accompaniment, it was found that it is usually embarrassing to accept being victimized by a woman, and they report being victims more psychologically than physically. The 5 participants who answered no made an expression of disbelief when responding. Figure 2 and relate to figure 3, it is evident that 13 of the 21 participants tend to have some consequence in their mental health when they are victims, generating in most cases emotional consequences such as stress, anxiety, social isolation, frustration, among others, and 8 people do not present any discomfort because of according it. To question 4, on where they have made the respective complaint when they have been victimized, it is reported that 20 participants and were no, some of them considering it is a situation of little seriousness. On the other hand, the person who answered yes affirmed that when they reported it to the police, they did not take the case with credibility. With respect to question 5, 86.7% of the participants do not say that they feel that their mental health is affected, considering that they do not make the respective complaints and therefore do not value the lack of prosecution. With respect to question 6, 19 of the participants state that they have not been supported by any psychological professional, and the other two have been supported by a psychological process approached from a different perspective. Question 7 reports that 18 participants know of a case of a man who has suffered domestic abuse, stating that these cases are not reported to the police. Question A, it is interpreted that for many men it is necessary that this latent problem should be better known and addressed by the population because many men suffer from mistreatment and do not feel supported by Colombian laws. In question 9, it is evident that 20 of the participants consider that stereotypes are related to the mistreatment of men. Also mentioning that in the history of Colombia, men have to be strong and dominant in the home. According to question 10, it is evident that 19 participants believe it is important for men who have been victims to have psychological support in order to improve their mental health. Based on question 11, it is identified that almost all participants consider that Colombian laws do not adequately address violence against men and therefore do not feel supported by them. And finally, in the question 12, it is evident that participants think that the mistreatment of men is not prosecuted in the same way as the mistreatment of women, due to the fact that the laws are designed to protect women and not men, as well as the influence of social status and socially create stereotypes towards men, since there is no margin for men to need protection, since men have certain biological advantage in terms of strength and social responsibilities that are different from those of women. This makes men feel ashamed of being judged if they are subjected by a woman. Besides being a topic that is not so well known publicly, which makes the abuse of women more visible globally and therefore more important.
When observing the answers of each subject, factors that influence the subject's mental health are evident. Since 16 of 21 participants have present domestic violence by a woman, being almost 80% of the surveyed population, and mention that they reached present stress, anxiety, frustration, guilt, among others. On the other hand, several participants mentioned that they would never denounce this violence since they present little credibility, mockery, and oppression by other people. This referring to the absence of laws that support men. Finally, it is evident that each participant had a different perspective of what violence against men is, and that their answer could be linked to the personal experience of each subject. First, a broad and detailed investigation was carried out inquiring into the historical, legal, and psychological framework of our central problem. On the other hand, through the survey carried out, it was possible to analyze and interpret each of the items. Finally, it was possible to show that gender violence is closely linked to the expected role in a society, and that it is a problem that occurs in the Colombian context and that has little legal support to support victims of violence by a woman.